She's gonna knock herself over with that cannon. I heard she cried when they issued it to her.
Yeah.
Look at her concentration. Bet she still misses the target completely.
She was 17 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and the only person on that range who hadn't yet shaved. The Navy SEALs standing behind her were laughing, not quietly, not politely. They were openly, loudly, brutally laughing at the girl who had just picked up a rifle that weighed nearly as much as her own torso and announced, without blinking, that she intended to qualify at the highest level of marksmanship the United States military had ever designed. One of the instructors, a decorated veteran with 3 combat deployments and a chest full of medals, leaned over to the man beside him and whispered something that made both of them laugh even harder. She heard it. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. She just exhaled slowly, pressed her cheek against the cold stock of the rifle, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet traveled 873 yards in just over a second. It hit the center of the target so perfectly that the scoring system initially flagged it as a malfunction, because no first shot, on a cold barrel, at that distance, under those wind conditions, from a 17-year-old girl who had never once fired in official competition, no first shot was ever supposed to look like that. The laughing stopped. What happened next on that range in the Nevada desert would eventually make its way into classified training reports, spark a fierce debate inside the special operations community about talent identification, and turn a quiet teenager from a small town in rural Montana into one of the most quietly celebrated and fiercely controversial figures in American military history. This is not a story about a prodigy who had everything handed to her. This is a story about what happens when a system built to break people meets someone it cannot break. This is the story of Cassidy Reyne, the girl the SEALs laughed at, the shot that silenced them, and the journey that changed everything that came after. Nobody in Mineral County, Montana ever expected Cassidy Reyne to amount to anything the rest of the world would care about. That is not a cruel observation. It is simply the geography of the place speaking for itself. Mineral County has fewer than 4,000 residents, 1 high school, 0 traffic lights, and a collective understanding that the children born there either stay forever or leave and are never heard from again. There is no middle ground. There is no version of the story where a kid from Mineral County becomes something extraordinary and then comes back to talk about it on a stage somewhere. That kind of thing happens in movies set in small towns. It does not happen in the actual small towns those movies pretend to understand. Cassidy was born in the spring, the second child of Dale and Margaret Reyne, in a house that sat on 11 acres of land backed up against the Cabinet Mountains. Dale worked as a forestry technician for the U.S. Forest Service. Margaret homeschooled both children through middle school, then relented and sent them to the public high school in Superior when Cassidy's older brother, Thomas, started pushing hard for organized sports and a social life that didn't involve their mother quizzing them on state capitals at the kitchen table. The house had no cable television until Cassidy was 11. They got internet when she was 13, and even then it was the kind of internet that loaded pages slowly and dropped out every time it rained hard. None of this is background texture. All of it matters, because the conditions of Cassidy's childhood are inseparable from what she eventually became. Dale Reyne was not a military man. He had never served. He had no particular romance about guns or warfare or the mythology of the American warrior. But he was a man who lived in the mountains, and living in the mountains in Montana means that firearms are simply part of the practical vocabulary of daily existence. You keep a rifle because you might encounter a bear. You keep a rifle because deer season feeds your family through the worst of winter. You keep a rifle because the nearest emergency services are 40 minutes away, on a good road in good weather, and the roads are not always good, and the weather is almost never good, from November through March. Dale taught both his children to shoot the same way he taught them to change a tire and start a fire, not as a skill to be celebrated, but as a competency required by the basic terms of their lives. Thomas was fine with a rifle. Cassidy was something else entirely. The first time Dale took her to the range behind their property, she was 9 years old. He handed her a .22 caliber bolt-action rifle, showed her the fundamentals the same way his own father had shown him, and stepped back to watch. Most kids at that age are overwhelmed by the noise, distracted by the recoil, and largely unable to hold a stable position long enough to place a decent shot. Cassidy put 3 rounds into a group so tight that Dale actually walked down to the target and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he walked back, looked at his daughter and said, "Do that again." She did. The group was smaller the second time. He didn't make a big deal of it. That was not how Dale Reyne operated. He didn't call anyone. He didn't post anything. This was before social media had fully colonized the interior lives of rural Montana families, and Dale was not the kind of man who would have posted it regardless. He just noted it the way you note something unusual in the natural world, with quiet attention and a decision to keep watching. Over the next 4 years, Cassidy shot whenever she could, which was often because ammunition in that household was purchased in bulk and stored in the basement the way other families stored canned goods. She was not trained by anyone with credentials. She had no coach, no mentor, no formal program. What she had was time, solitude, a father who occasionally corrected her form with the minimal vocabulary of a man who valued efficiency over encouragement, and an almost biological compulsion to understand exactly why a shot went where it went. That last part is what separated her from every other kid in Mineral County who grew up around guns. Most people who shoot regularly develop a feel for it. Cassidy developed a philosophy. She kept a notebook, a plain, wire-bound composition book that she bought at the drugstore in Superior, in which she recorded every shot she fired with any degree of seriousness. Distance, wind speed, estimated by observation since she had no instruments, temperature, elevation, what the bullet did, what she thought it would do versus what it actually did, the gap between expectation and result, analyzed in her own self-taught language, worked over until she understood it well enough to close it the next time. By the time she was 12, the notebook was full. She started another one. Thomas shot for the high school rifle team and was considered pretty good. When Cassidy showed up to a practice session her freshman year, she had come to give Thomas a ride home because the car situation in the Reyne household was permanently complicated. The coach, a physical education teacher named Harlan Briggs, who had coached the team for 15 years, asked her if she wanted to try a few shots while she waited. He was being polite. He assumed she would struggle with the equipment and find it humbling. He was wrong about that. She fired a string of 5 shots in the kneeling position, a position she had never formally practiced, on a course she had never seen, with a rifle she had picked up 60 seconds earlier, and the grouping was better than anything Briggs had seen from a first-time shooter in 15 years. Not better than average, better than anything. He stood behind her for a moment, with his arms folded, watching, and then said very quietly, "Have you done this before?" It wasn't a question. He already knew the answer was complicated. Cassidy joined the team. Within 8 weeks, she was the best shooter on it. By the end of her freshman year, she was the best high school shooter in the state in her age group, competing in categories designed for students 2 and 3 years older than her. The wins accumulated without fanfare because competitive rifle shooting does not generate fanfare in Montana high schools. Football generates fanfare. Basketball generates fanfare. A quiet girl consistently putting rounds through the same hole at 200 yards generates a certain respectful acknowledgement among the people who understand what they're watching, and essentially nothing from anyone else. She didn't care about the recognition. This is the part that people who came to know Cassidy later would consistently report as the thing that most distinguished her from other competitors they had encountered. She was not motivated by the scoreboard. She was motivated by something internal and essentially private that she struggled to articulate even when asked directly. The closest she ever came to explaining it was in a brief conversation with Harlan Briggs during her sophomore year, when he asked her what she was thinking about right before she fired. She thought about the question for a moment and then said, "Nothing. I'm thinking about nothing. I'm just trying to make the bullet go where it's supposed to go." Briggs repeated that line for years afterward. He thought it captured something important. He was right. What nobody in Superior, Montana knew during those high school years, what Cassidy herself barely understood, was that she was developing a skill set that operated at a level so far above the context in which it was being expressed, that the context itself was nearly irrelevant. High school shooting competitions were measuring something real, but they were measuring it with instruments too crude to show the actual magnitude of what was there. It was like using a bathroom scale to weigh something that required a laboratory. The number would tell you something. It would not tell you the truth. The truth would require a different setting, a different instrument, a different kind of pressure. And that pressure was coming. in the form of a summer program that Cassidy applied to on a whim, that she had no realistic expectation of getting into, and that would place her, 17 years old and barely known outside her home county, on a range in the Nevada desert, in front of a group of Navy SEALs who had no idea what they were about to witness. The application was a single page printed from a government website that loaded so slowly on the Reyne family internet connection that Cassidy had to start the download before she went to bed and check it in the morning. The program was called the National Youth Precision Athletics Initiative, which was a name so deliberately bland that it communicated almost nothing about what the program actually was or who actually ran it. That was intentional. The people who designed the program had learned, through experience, that the more accurately you described what you were doing, the more political resistance you generated. And political resistance was the thing that killed good programs faster than any other force in the federal bureaucracy. So they named it something that sounded like a summer enrichment camp for kids interested in archery, and called it a day. It was not a summer enrichment camp for kids interested in archery. The National Youth Precision Athletics Initiative was a talent identification program operated under a joint agreement between the Department of Defense and a civilian nonprofit that, if you looked it up, had an address in Northern Virginia and a website with 4 pages of content and a contact form that nobody ever responded to. The program's actual function was to identify young Americans between the ages of 16 and 19 who demonstrated measurable aptitude in precision disciplines, marksmanship, archery, certain categories of competitive swimming and diving, and a small number of other areas that shared the quality of requiring the practitioner to perform an extremely precise physical act under conditions of significant psychological pressure. The Defense Department's interest in these individuals was not covert. It was simply quiet. They were looking for people who might, in 5 or 10 years, be worth recruiting into specialized training pipelines that demanded a specific combination of physical capability and mental architecture that was genuinely rare and extremely difficult to develop in someone who didn't already have the foundational wiring for it. Cassidy found the program because Thomas had found it first. He had seen a mention of it on a shooting forum he followed, posted by a user who had attended 2 years earlier and described it in terms vague enough to be intriguing and specific enough to confirm that it was real. Thomas had considered applying but decided against it because the program ran for 6 weeks in July and August, which conflicted with a construction job he had lined up that summer that paid well enough to matter. He mentioned it to Cassidy the way older siblings mention things to younger ones, as an afterthought, with the implicit assumption that the information was interesting but probably not actionable. He was wrong about that too. Thomas was frequently wrong about what Cassidy would and wouldn't do with information once she had it. The application required 3 things: a short personal statement of no more than 500 words, 2 letters of recommendation from adults outside the family who could speak to the applicant's character and demonstrated skill, and a performance portfolio, which in the case of a competitive shooter meant documented results from sanctioned competitions over the preceding 2 years. Cassidy had no difficulty with any of these requirements. Harlan Briggs wrote her a letter that he later described as the most accurate thing he had ever put his name on, because every sentence was simply a factual description of something he had personally witnessed, and the facts themselves were extraordinary enough that he didn't need to embellish anything. The second letter came from a man named Victor Salcedo, a competitive long-range shooter from Missoula who had encountered Cassidy at a regional open competition the previous fall, watched her shoot for 20 minutes, and then introduced himself and asked if she had ever considered training seriously. She had told him she didn't know what training seriously would mean for someone like her, in a place like this, with resources like the ones she had access to. Salcedo had given her his card and said to call him if she ever figured it out. She called him when she needed the letter. He wrote it the same day she asked. Her personal statement was, by her own later admission, not particularly well written. She was not a natural writer. She was precise with numbers and with the physical world, but language was a medium she approached with a kind of cautious pragmatism that sometimes made her prose feel flat. What the statement lacked in style, it made up for in clarity. She described in plain language when she had started shooting, what she had taught herself, what she understood about the mechanics of long-range precision, and why she wanted to attend the program. The why was the most honest part. She wrote that she wanted to find out how good she actually was, because she had no way of knowing that in the environment she currently occupied, and not knowing it bothered her in a way she couldn't fully explain, but that felt important to pay attention to. The admissions committee for the program received 412 applications that year. They accepted 22. Cassidy's acceptance letter arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, which she later found out was standard procedure, and which she found faintly amusing, given that the program's name was public record, and its general purpose was not exactly classified. She read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the drawer of her nightstand, and went to find her father. She handed it to him without saying anything. Dale read it, handed it back, and said, "I figured," which was, coming from Dale Reyne, essentially equivalent to a standing ovation. The program was held at a training facility outside of Fallon, Nevada, which is a small city in the high desert about 60 miles east of Reno and home to Naval Air Station Fallon, the Navy's premier tactical air warfare training center. The Precision Athletics program used a separate facility on the edge of the NAS footprint, close enough to share infrastructure but operationally distinct, with its own range complex, barracks, and staff. The 22 participants arrived in late June on a Monday morning, transported from the Reno airport in a pair of government vans driven by men in civilian clothes who answered questions politely and said very little else. Cassidy sat in the back of the second van and watched the desert pass outside the window and felt for the first time in her life a specific quality of anticipation that she would later describe as the feeling of finally being in the right place to find out something true. The other 21 participants were not what she expected, though she would have struggled to articulate what she had expected. There were 6 other girls. The rest were boys. Ages ranged from 16 to 19. Several of them were from competitive shooting backgrounds with far more formal training and national-level credentials than Cassidy had accumulated. A boy from Texas named Garrett Odom had placed in the top 5 at the National Junior Olympic Championships the previous year and carried himself with the specific confidence of someone who has been told by enough credible people that he is exceptional, that he has stopped questioning whether it might not be true. There was a girl from Virginia named Priya Anand who had a private coach, a custom-built rifle that cost more than the Reyne family's truck, and a resume of competition results that Cassidy had looked up online after the acceptance letters went out and found genuinely impressive. These were not the kids from Mineral County High School's rifle team. These were the kids who existed in a tier of competitive shooting that Cassidy had known about abstractly, but never actually encountered in person. She was not intimidated. This is worth being specific about, because it would be easy and dramatically convenient to say that she was intimidated and then overcame it. The more accurate truth is that she evaluated the other participants the way she evaluated everything, with careful, quiet attention, arriving at provisional conclusions that she was prepared to revise when new information became available. And what she concluded in those first hours was that several of them were very good, a few of them were probably great, and none of them had her specific combination of instincts and self-developed technique that had emerged not from formal coaching, but from years of solitary problem-solving in the mountains of Montana. Whether that combination was an advantage or a liability in this particular environment was something she didn't yet know. She intended to find out. The staff of the program was a mix of civilian instructors and active-duty military personnel, including, as Cassidy and the other participants learned on the second day, a rotating group of observers from various special operations units who cycled through the facility during the 6-week program to evaluate the participants against criteria that the program's civilian directors described only in general terms. The participants were told that their performance would be documented, and that the documentation might inform future outreach from military recruiting pipelines, but that this was entirely optional and that the program's primary purpose was athletic development. This was technically true. It was also in the way of many technically true statements made by government programs, somewhat incomplete as a description of what was actually happening. The Navy SEALs arrived in the 3rd week. There were 4 of them, and they arrived on a Tuesday morning with the low-key self-possession of men who are so accustomed to being the most capable people in any given space that they have stopped needing to demonstrate it. They wore civilian clothes. They were introduced only by first names. The oldest of them, a broad-shouldered man named Reed, who had a scar running along his left jawline, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to conserve energy at a cellular level, did most of the talking. He explained that they would be observing the long-range qualification exercises scheduled for that week and that the participants should conduct themselves exactly as they had been doing and not adjust their performance based on the presence of observers. This instruction was of course impossible to fully follow, because human beings do not perform identically when they know they are being watched by decorated special operations veterans as when they believe they are performing for a routine training evaluation. Everyone on the range that morning understood this. Reed understood it best of all, which is precisely why he gave the instruction. He wanted to see how each participant handled the additional pressure. That was the data point he was actually there to collect. What happened over the next 2 days, before Cassidy's turn came, was that the other participants shot well. Several of them shot very well. Garrett Odom, predictably, put up numbers that drew quiet nods from the observers and a brief low conversation between Reed and the man beside him that Odom noticed and filed away with visible satisfaction. Priya Anand had a difficult first session and a strong second one, which the experienced observers correctly read as a sign of genuine mental resilience rather than inconsistency. The group overall was performing at a level that justified the program's existence and the observers' time. Everyone was demonstrating competence. A few were demonstrating something beyond competence. And then it was Cassidy's turn, and the laughing started. It started because of the rifle. The long-range qualification exercise used a platform that several of the participants had trained on extensively and that Cassidy had never touched before that morning. She picked it up with the particular careful attention of someone encountering a new tool for the first time, examining it, weighing it, making small adjustments to her position to accommodate its geometry. And this process, which took her about 90 seconds, apparently struck one of the observers as evidence that she was out of her depth. A comment was made. The other observers responded. The laughter was brief, but it was real, and it was the kind of laughter that carries a specific social message, which is that the person being laughed at has already been evaluated and found to belong in a different category than the people doing the laughing. Cassidy heard it. She processed it the way she processed all incoming data, noted it, assessed its relevance to the task in front of her, and set it aside. Then she settled into her position, controlled her breathing, and prepared to fire the first shot of the rest of her life. The wind at Fallon that morning was coming from the northwest at approximately 11 miles per hour with irregular gusts that pushed it to 14 or 15 before dropping back. Cassidy knew this not because anyone had told her. The range's wind measurement equipment was displayed on a board at the firing line that all participants could reference, but because she had been watching the mirage patterns on the desert floor for the previous 20 minutes while the other participants completed their sequences, and the mirage told her things that the equipment confirmed but couldn't fully communicate. Mirage reading is one of the oldest skills in precision shooting, predating modern instrumentation by centuries, and it is a skill that cannot be taught efficiently in a classroom, because it requires a quality of patient visual attention that either exists in a person or it doesn't. You can explain what to look for. You cannot manufacture the capacity to actually see it. Cassidy had been reading Mirage since she was 11 years old, lying on her stomach on a hillside behind the family property, watching heat rise off the rocky ground between her position and a steel target her father had placed at 300 yards. She had learned it the same way she learned everything, alone, slowly, through accumulated observation, without anyone to confirm or correct her interpretations, until the results either validated or contradicted her reading. The target for the qualification exercise was at 873 yards. This was the number that had been posted on the range briefing sheet that morning, and it was the number that several of the participants had spent the previous evening calculating solutions for, using ballistic apps on their phones and the specific ammunition data provided by the program staff. This was standard procedure for serious competitive shooters preparing for a known distance exercise. You gather your data in advance, you build your firing solution, you make adjustments on the day based on actual conditions. It is a methodical process, and the methodical process exists because long-range precision shooting is, at its core, an applied physics problem, and applied physics problems respond well to methodical preparation. Cassidy had done the calculations. She had also done something else that none of the other participants had done, or at least none that the observers had noticed. The evening before the qualification exercise, after dinner, and before the mandatory lights out that the program enforced with the mild but firm consistency of a summer camp that understood it was working with competitive personalities who would otherwise stay up until 2 in the morning discussing ballistics, Cassidy had gone back to the range alone. Not to shoot. The range was closed and she had no intention of violating the program's rules, which she understood to be reasonable and which she respected for that reason. She had gone to stand at the firing line and look at the target in the fading desert light, and simply be present in the space where the work would happen the next morning. She did this because she had learned, through experience, that her best performances came when she had given herself the opportunity to develop what she privately thought of as a feel for the distance. Not a calculation, a feel. The distinction mattered to her even though she couldn't fully explain it to anyone else, and she had mostly stopped trying. When she settled into her position at the firing line on Tuesday morning, and the observers made their comments and the brief laughter moved through the group behind her, what Cassidy was experiencing internally was not anger, which would have been understandable, and not a performative calm designed to project competence to the people watching her, which would have been human. What she was experiencing was something closer to focus acquiring its final sharpest form. She had a name for this state, which she had never shared with anyone because it seemed like the kind of thing that would sound strange spoken aloud. She called it the narrowing. It was the moment when everything outside the specific physical and mental tasks immediately in front of her simply ceased to register. Not suppressed, not ignored, just genuinely absent from her awareness, the way sound is absent from a room that has none in it, rather than the way sound is absent from a room where someone has covered their ears. The narrowing was not an effort. It arrived on its own when the conditions for it were right, and the conditions for it were almost always right when something was at stake, and someone had just told her, explicitly or implicitly, that she didn't belong. She acquired the target through her scope. The adjustments she had dialed in the previous evening based on her calculations were her starting point, modified by 2 small corrections she made based on what the mirage was telling her about the actual wind in the valley between the firing line and the target, a wind that was slightly different from what the measurement equipment at the firing line was showing, because the equipment measured conditions at one point, and the bullet would travel through 3 distinct microclimates over the course of its flight, and the equipment could tell you about one of them. She adjusted for all 3. Then she did nothing for 11 seconds. This was the part that the observers noticed even before the shot. Reed, the senior man, had been watching participants shoot for 2 days, and in 2 days he had developed a calibrated sense of the rhythm at which each participant operated. Some of them were quick, which was not inherently a flaw but was worth noting. Some of them were methodical to the point of rigidity, which was a different kind of flaw and a more serious one under certain conditions. What he had not seen in 2 days was a participant who went genuinely, completely still for 11 seconds before firing. Not the stillness of hesitation, not the stillness of someone managing anxiety, the stillness of someone who had finished all preparation and was simply waiting for the exact right moment the way a hawk waits before it commits to a dive. Not paralyzed, not uncertain, but completely and efficiently present in the moment before action. Reed had seen that quality twice before in his career, in 2 different people, both of whom had gone on to perform at levels that justified the description extraordinary. He filed the observation and said nothing. Cassidy fired. The .308 round left the barrel at approximately 2,600 feet per second. At that velocity, with the ballistic characteristics of the specific match-grade ammunition the program provided, it would take just over a second to cover 873 yards. In that second, the round would drop approximately 27 feet from its line of departure due to gravity, drift a calculable number of inches to the right due to the spin imparted by the rifle's rifling interacting with the crosswind, and decelerate continuously as atmospheric drag bled velocity from it over the distance. All of this was physics. All of it was calculable, was only as good as the inputs, and the inputs were only as good as the shooter's ability to read conditions that were not static, that shifted in real time as wind moved through a desert valley in ways that no instrument fully captured. The difference between a first-round hit and a first-round miss at that distance, under those conditions, often came down to the quality of the shooter's read on conditions that the instruments couldn't measure. It came down to feel. It came down to something that lived in the space between calculation and instinct, which is a space that most people never find their way into regardless of how many hours they spend trying. The bullet hit the center of the target, not near the center, not the inner scoring ring, the center, the precise geometric center of a target that, at 873 yards, subtended an angle of view so small that it was essentially invisible to the naked eye. and required the scope not just to see, but to aim at with any precision whatsoever. The scoring system registered the impact, and then, because the impact was in a location so close to the absolute center that it fell within the system's error margin for mechanical malfunction, flagged it for manual verification. One of the range staff walked down to the target, examined it, and keyed his radio. The confirmation came back in a flat, professional voice that communicated the factual result without editorial comment, which was the training the range staff had received, and which in this particular moment required a certain disciplined neutrality, because the factual result was not something that happened often enough to feel routine. The silence behind Cassidy lasted for approximately 4 seconds. Reed was the first to speak, and what he said was not directed at Cassidy. He turned to the man beside him, a chief petty officer named Marcus, who had spent 11 years in special operations and was not easily impressed by anything. "Pull her file." Marcus nodded once and took out his phone. Cassidy, who was still in her firing position and in the final stages of the narrowing fading back to ordinary awareness, did not hear this exchange. She would learn about it much later, from Reed himself, in a conversation that took place under circumstances she could not have predicted that morning on the range. What Cassidy did hear was the absence of the laughter. The contrast between what had been happening behind her 60 seconds earlier and what was happening now was so complete that it registered even through the residual focus of the narrowing. She did not turn around. She did not look at the observers. She worked the bolt of the rifle, prepared for her second shot, and did the thing that separated her from almost every other shooter who had ever performed an exceptional first shot in front of an audience. She treated the first shot as information rather than achievement. She analyzed the trace, the flight path of the bullet as visible through the scope, and the impact data coming back from the range. And she made a small adjustment, not because the first shot had been wrong, but because the wind had shifted 2 miles per hour in the 11 seconds between her final read and the bullet's arrival, and the wind might shift again, and she intended to place the second round in a location indistinguishable from the first. She did, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, which completed the qualification string and which hit within a margin of the first 4 impacts, so small that when the range staff photographed the target and printed the image for the program's records, several people who had not been present for the shooting assumed, reasonably, that the image showed a single impact rather than 5 separate ones. Garrett Odom, standing 6 feet to Cassidy's left, watched the 5th shot hit and then looked at his own target from the previous hour and was quiet for a long time. He was not a graceless person. What he felt in that moment was complicated, as it tends to be when someone you have never previously considered as a serious rival performs at a level that recontextualizes your understanding of your own ability. He processed it with more maturity than many 19-year-olds would have managed, and said later that afternoon that watching Cassidy shoot was the first time in his competitive career that he had felt the particular clarifying sensation of understanding that the ceiling he had been working toward was not actually the ceiling, that there was more above it. He found this simultaneously deflating and genuinely exciting. He thought about it for a long time afterward. Reed spent the rest of that day watching Cassidy, not the shooting. The shooting was already documented and would be analyzed later with the clinical precision that special operations culture applies to any data point it considers potentially significant. He watched how she moved between firing strings, how she interacted with the other participants, how she responded to the range staff's feedback, which was substantive and technically demanding, how she ate her lunch, alone, at the end of a table, reading something in a small notebook that he assumed was her shot log, and that turned out, when he eventually asked her about it, to be exactly that. He was building a picture, not of a shooter, of a person, because the shooting was remarkable, but shooting was a skill, and skills could be measured and compared and ranked. What Reed was trying to understand was the architecture of the person behind the skill, the mental and emotional structure that had produced this specific performance under this specific kind of pressure, because that architecture was either there or it wasn't, and if it was there, it was worth far more than the shooting itself. By the end of the day, he had a provisional conclusion. He was careful with provisional conclusions. He had been wrong before, in both directions. People he had assessed as extraordinary, who had failed under the specific pressures of selection, and people he had initially dismissed, who had gone on to outlast nearly everyone else. He held his conclusions lightly until the evidence made lightness irresponsible. But the provisional conclusion he arrived at regarding Cassidy Reyne on that Tuesday afternoon in the Nevada desert was one he would not substantially revise in the months and years that followed. He thought she might be the most naturally gifted precision shooter he had encountered in 22 years of operational experience, and he thought that the shooting, remarkable as it was probably not even close to the most interesting thing about her. The remaining 3 weeks of the program changed after Tuesday. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been obvious to someone observing the daily schedule from the outside, because the schedule itself remained largely the same. Morning physical training, technical instruction blocks, range sessions in the afternoon, evening debriefs that were part educational seminar and part psychological assessment disguised as casual conversation. The structure held. What shifted was something beneath the structure, in the way certain people in the facility oriented themselves relative to Cassidy, and in the way Cassidy began to understand, slowly and without particular excitement, that she had crossed some kind of invisible line, and that the world on the other side of it operated according to rules she had not yet fully mapped. Reed stayed for the rest of the week. He had been scheduled to rotate out on Wednesday, replaced by a different observer from a different unit, but he made a phone call Tuesday evening and adjusted his schedule in a way that required no explanation to anyone at the facility, because Reed was the kind of person whose schedule adjustments did not require explanation. He was not obvious about his continued attention to Cassidy. He watched her the way experienced evaluators watch people they are seriously considering, not with focused, trackable attention that the subject would notice and potentially perform for, but with the distributed peripheral awareness of someone who has learned to gather information without appearing to gather it. Cassidy noticed anyway. She noticed because she had grown up in the mountains watching animals that did not want to be watched, and the skills of patient observation transfer across contexts in ways that are not always immediately obvious. She said nothing about it. She filed it and continued doing what she had been doing, which was performing at the level she was capable of and trying to learn everything the program had to teach her. The instruction she was receiving in those remaining weeks was the best she had ever encountered, not because the individual instructors were necessarily more knowledgeable than Harlan Briggs or Victor Salcedo, though some of them were, but because for the first time in her life she was being taught in an environment that had been specifically designed to push people who were already operating near the top of their capability. The program was not built for beginners. It was built for people who had already done the work to reach a high baseline and who needed to encounter the specific kinds of friction and challenge that would reveal what they were made of above that baseline. For Cassidy, who had spent her entire development as a shooter working against the ceiling of what she could teach herself in isolation, this environment was the equivalent of suddenly being given access to oxygen after years of learning to function on less than the standard amount. She absorbed everything. This was not metaphor. The program staff noted it in their individual evaluations, using language that was professionally neutral but that carried, beneath the neutral surface, a quality of genuine surprise. One instructor, a civilian named Dr. Patricia O'Hara, who held a doctorate in sports psychology and had worked with Olympic-level athletes for 15 years before joining the program, wrote in her Week 4 assessment that Cassidy demonstrated the fastest observable integration of new technical information she had encountered in a precision athlete outside of individuals who had been in full-time professional training environments for multiple years. She noted that this was particularly unusual, given that Cassidy's background was essentially self-directed, and that self-directed learners typically showed stronger resistance to incorporated external correction, because their self-developed techniques were more deeply embedded and psychologically identified with than techniques learned from coaches. Cassidy showed almost no such resistance. When an instructor corrected something, she would listen with complete attention, ask 1 or 2 questions that were always precise and never defensive, incorporate the correction in her next session, and move on. There was no ego in the process. Or rather, and Dr. O'Hara was careful about this distinction in her notes, there was ego in the sense of a strong, stable sense of self. But that self was not threatened by being wrong about technical details, because being wrong about technical details and then correcting it was simply how you got better. And getting better was the point. The ego and the learning were not in conflict with each other. This, Dr. O'Hara wrote, was genuinely rare. The other participants adjusted to Cassidy's presence in the group in different ways. Garrett Odom, after his initial period of recalibration, moved toward her with the pragmatic intelligence of a serious competitor who understands that proximity to someone better than you is more valuable than the comfort of being the best person in the room. He started asking her questions during the evening sessions, technical questions, specific ones about her reads on particular conditions and her reasoning behind specific adjustments. Cassidy answered honestly and completely because she had no instinct for competitive secrecy, which some people read as naivety, and which was actually something more like a fundamental indifference to the social game of competitive positioning. She wasn't sharing her methods because she was generous, exactly. She was sharing them because someone had asked a genuine question, and she had a genuine answer, and withholding it would have felt like a pointless performance of a kind of strategic self-interest she found genuinely uninteresting. Odom recognized this quality and respected it in a way that developed over the remaining weeks of the program into something closer to friendship than either of them had expected. Priya Anand was more complicated. Priya had arrived at the program as the participant with the most formally impressive credentials, and the first week had confirmed that those credentials were legitimate. She was technically excellent, rigorously trained, and performed with a consistency that reflected years of high-level coaching and competition. The emergence of Cassidy as the program's clear standout created a dynamic that Priya navigated with visible difficulty in the short term and impressive self-awareness in the longer term. She did not become hostile. She became quieter, more internal, more focused on her own work in a way that the staff read as productive recalibration rather than withdrawal. By the fifth week, she had made adjustments to her technique based partly on observations of Cassidy that she incorporated without acknowledgement, but also without denial, when asked about them directly. She and Cassidy were never close during the program, but they developed a mutual respect that was real if understated, and that would become more significant later in contexts neither of them could have anticipated during those 6 weeks in Nevada. Reed returned in the fifth week with 2 other men Cassidy had not seen before. They were introduced with the same first-name-only protocol as before, which by this point Cassidy understood was not a security measure in any meaningful sense, but rather a cultural norm of the community. These men came from a community that had developed, through long operational experience, a habit of traveling lightly through any space that wasn't its own, taking up as little surface area as possible, offering as few data points for assessment as courtesy permitted. The 2 new men were younger than Reed, mid-30s rather than mid-40s, and they carried themselves with a slightly different energy, more kinetic, less settled, the particular quality of people who are still in the most active phase of operational life, rather than beginning the transition toward the roles that come after it. They watched the range sessions for 2 days without speaking to any of the participants, and then on the 3rd day, one of them, introduced as Cal, sat down next to Cassidy at the end of afternoon range time and asked if she had a few minutes. She said yes. She always said yes to people who asked direct questions without preamble, because directness was a quality she valued and reciprocated instinctively. Cal asked her about her background, which she described straightforwardly. He asked about her self-teaching process, and she described it in terms that she could tell surprised him slightly, not because the description was unusual, but because it was precise. She wasn't telling a story about herself. She was giving him an accurate technical account of a development process, with the same kind of clear-eyed specificity she applied to analyzing a shot. He asked her what she wanted to do after high school, and this was the question that gave her the most pause, because it was the question she had been circling for 2 years without landing on an answer that felt fully honest. She told him she didn't know. She told him she knew that the thing she was best at was this, and that she had been trying to figure out what this could become in the context of a life, but that the options she could see from where she currently stood, competitive shooting at the civilian level, coaching, some combination of outdoor work that kept her in environments where her skills were relevant, none of them felt like they fully used what she actually had. She said this without self-pity, as a factual assessment of an unsolved problem. Cal listened to the whole answer without interrupting, which she noted and appreciated. Then he asked if she had ever thought about military service. She had. She told him she had, and that the thinking had always run into the same obstacle, which was that the conventional military paths available to women, particularly in roles that would make use of her specific capabilities, seemed to involve a significant gap between the skills she brought and the contexts in which those skills could be officially applied. She was aware that this was changing. She was aware that the lines were moving. She was not certain they were moving fast enough or far enough to matter for her specific situation. Cal listened to this answer too. Then he said, without particular drama, that there were pathways that most people didn't know existed, and that the purpose of programs like this one was partly to identify people for whom those pathways might be worth discussing in more detail. He did not make promises. He did not describe specifics. He spoke in the careful, non-committal language of someone opening a door slightly to see whether the person in front of them was interested in knowing that the door existed. Cassidy asked him one question. She asked whether the pathways he was describing would put her in a position where her capabilities could be used at their actual level, rather than at the level that the relevant institutional structures currently defined as appropriate for someone of her demographic profile. It was a more sophisticated question than Cal had expected from a 17-year-old, phrased with a precision that reflected both genuine intelligence and a clear-eyed awareness of how institutions work that he more typically encountered in people who had already spent years inside them. He told her honestly that he couldn't guarantee it, but that the honest answer was closer to yes than to no, and that the people he worked with were more interested in capability than in the categories that capability came packaged in, because capability was rare and categories were administrative. She nodded and said she would think about it. She thought about it every day for the rest of the program. The final week was an evaluation week, structured as a compressed version of the qualification exercises from the first half of the program, combined with a series of scenarios that introduced variables, time pressure, position changes, equipment anomalies, simulated environmental disruptions that tested not just technical skill but adaptability. The scenarios were designed by people who understood that the real value of a precision shooter was not what they could do under ideal conditions, which the earlier exercises had measured, but what they could do when the conditions stopped being ideal, which was the actual operational question. This distinction is one that separates good-range shooters from people who are useful in the context that Reed and Cal and the men they worked with actually cared about. Cassidy performed in the final evaluation week in a way that the program staff would later describe, in internal documentation, as the strongest combined performance in the program's 11-year history. Not the strongest shooting performance, though that was part of it. The strongest combined performance, shooting, adaptability, decision-making under pressure, composure when equipment malfunctioned on the third day of evaluation in a way that would have caused most participants to lose significant time and accuracy while managing their frustration. Cassidy's response to the malfunction was so efficient and so unemotional that one of the observers asked afterward whether she had been pre-briefed that it was coming. She had not been. She had simply assessed the situation, identified the solution, implemented it, and returned to the task. The whole process took 40 seconds. The observer timed it. On the last night of the program, Reed asked Cassidy to walk with him to the edge of the range complex, where the desert opened up, and the lights of Fallon were visible in the distance as a low orange glow against the dark. They stood there for a moment without speaking, which was a thing Reed apparently did, and which Cassidy found not uncomfortable but clarifying, in the way that silence with people who are comfortable in silence tends to be clarifying. Then Reed said that he wanted to be straightforward with her about something, and that he hoped she would take what he was about to say in the spirit it was intended, which was the spirit of genuine respect rather than recruitment. He told her that in 22 years, he had encountered perhaps a dozen people who had what she had in the combination and the proportion she had it. He told her that most of those people had gone on to careers that used what they had, and that the ones who hadn't, for whatever reason, circumstance or choice or timing, were the ones he thought about when he was being honest with himself about what the work cost and what it was worth. He told her he didn't know what she would decide or what path would open for her, but that he thought she owed it to herself to find out what she was actually capable of in an environment built to answer that question. Cassidy listened to all of it. Then she asked him one question. She asked whether, in the 22 years and the dozen people he was describing, any of them had been a 17-year-old girl from Mineral County, Montana. Reed smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. He said no. Then he said that was exactly why he was having this conversation. The drive back to Montana from the Reno airport took 11 hours because Cassidy had arranged to be picked up by Thomas, who had driven down in the family truck with a cracked windshield and a cooler full of gas station sandwiches and questions he didn't ask for the first 4 hours. which was his way of saying he understood that she needed time to decompress before she could talk about anything. They drove north through Nevada and into Idaho in the particular silence of siblings who have known each other long enough to communicate accurately without words. And somewhere in the dark stretch of highway between Twin Falls and the Idaho-Montana border, Cassidy told him about the shot. Not about Reed, not about Cal, not about the evaluations or the final week or the conversation at the edge of the range in the Nevada desert. Just the shot, the first one. 873 yards on a cold barrel with a rifle she had picked up 60 seconds earlier in front of people who had been laughing at her. Thomas drove for a while without responding. Then he said, "I know." She asked him how he knew. He said he had gotten a call from Harlan Briggs, who had gotten a call from Victor Salcedo, who had somehow heard something from someone, which was the way information moved in the small world of competitive shooting in the Mountain West. Indirectly, through networks of people who knew each other from competitions and forums, and the specific camaraderie of a pursuit that most of the broader culture found either baffling or invisible. The information that had reached Salcedo was incomplete and slightly distorted by its passage through several intermediary conversations, but the core of it was accurate. A 17-year-old girl from Montana had done something at a government facility in Nevada that had gotten people talking. Thomas said he had sat with that information for 2 weeks and not called her because he didn't know what to say. He said he still didn't know what to say. He said he was proud of her in a way that felt too big for the word proud, which was the most articulate he ever got about it, and which Cassidy told him later was the most meaningful thing anyone said to her in the entire period surrounding the program. She spent her senior year of high school in a state of productive suspension. She knew something was coming. She didn't know its exact shape. Cal had told her before the program ended that she would be contacted after her 18th birthday, which was in the spring, and that the contact would be more specific than the conversation they had already had, and that she should, in the meantime, continue doing what she was doing and not make any decisions based on possibilities that had not yet been made concrete. This was good advice, and she followed it. She shot. She competed in her final year of high school competition and won everything there was to win at the state level by margins that had stopped being surprising to anyone who had been watching her for more than a year. She applied to 2 universities, one in Missoula, one in Bozeman, not because she was certain she would attend either, but because completing the applications felt like maintaining optionality, which was a concept she had absorbed from one of the instruction blocks at the Nevada program, and that she found genuinely useful as an organizing principle for decisions made under uncertainty. She graduated in May. The contact came in June, 3 weeks after her 18th birthday, in the form of a letter that arrived in the same kind of plain white envelope as her program acceptance had, with the same absence of return address. The letter contained a date, a location, a point of contact name, and 4 sentences of context that told her enough to understand what was being proposed, without telling her anything that would have been problematic if the letter had been read by someone other than her. She read it once, put it in the drawer with the program acceptance letter, and called the number at the bottom. The person who answered was Cal. What followed over the next 18 months is a chapter of Cassidy's story that exists in a documentary record that is not fully public and that she has discussed in detail only in contexts where the discussion itself was controlled and purposeful. The broad outline is knowable. She entered a preparatory pipeline that was designed to evaluate whether individuals identified through programs, like the Nevada Initiative, were viable candidates for specialized training tracks that the military had been quietly developing for a small number of women who met a specific and exceptionally demanding profile. The pipeline was not selection in the formal sense that the term carries in special operations culture. It was, more accurately, a prolonged and systematic attempt to find out whether the qualities that had been observed in a controlled environment at a government range in Nevada were durable under conditions of sustained pressure, physical hardship, sleep deprivation, and the particular psychological stress of operating in an institutional environment that was simultaneously trying to include you and had not yet fully decided whether it believed inclusion was the right decision. Cassidy navigated this environment the way she navigated everything, with patient, unsentimental attention to what was actually in front of her, rather than what she feared might be there, or hoped would be there. She was not naive about the institutional ambivalence she was operating within. She understood, with the same clear-eyed accuracy she brought to reading wind conditions, that there were people in the structure around her who were genuinely invested in her success, and people who were genuinely skeptical that success was achievable or desirable, and a larger number of people who were simply waiting to see what the data produced before forming a view. She treated all three groups the same way. She performed. She did not make arguments for herself using words when she could make them using results, because she had learned from the Nevada experience that results, in this world, were the only currency that moved without friction across the full spectrum of institutional opinion. The physical demands of the pipeline were significant, and she met them, though not without cost. She had not come from a background of formal physical training. Her fitness was the functional, durable kind that comes from a life lived outdoors in a demanding environment, not the optimized, sport-specific kind that formal athletic programs produce. The pipeline's physical standards were designed for candidates who had been deliberately preparing for them, and Cassidy had been preparing for them for approximately 8 months, from a baseline that was good but not purpose-built. She had moments of genuine difficulty. She did not quit during any of them, which was the relevant metric, but she also did not pretend the difficulty wasn't real, which was a quality that her evaluators noted with the particular appreciation of people who have seen what happens when someone manages hardship through denial rather than acknowledgement, and then encounters something they can't deny their way through. The shooting components of the pipeline were, by contrast, the parts where she was most purely herself. There is a specific quality of performance that emerges when someone encounters a context that is exactly calibrated to what they actually are. And watching Cassidy shoot in the environments the pipeline created, varied, unpredictable, demanding in ways that went far beyond what any competition or standard training range could replicate, had on the people observing it something of the effect that her first shot at Nevada had produced, but sustained and deepened and made more complex by the variety of conditions and demands the pipeline generated. She was not just accurate. She was accurate in ways and under conditions that most of the evaluation staff had not seen combined in a single individual at her stage of development. She made decisions under time pressure that reflected a quality of spatial and situational understanding that was not, as far as anyone could determine, the product of specific training. It seemed to be native. An evaluator who had spent a decade in reconnaissance roles wrote in his assessment that watching Cassidy work through a complex scenario was like watching someone read a text in a language everyone else in the room was still learning. The fluency was of a different order. Reed appeared twice during the 18 months of the pipeline, not as an official evaluator. His role had shifted by then, and his formal involvement with the program had a different character than it had at Nevada. He appeared as someone who was tracking a result he had predicted and wanted to verify that his prediction was holding. Both times he said very little. Both times the fact of his presence communicated something that the people around him understood without needing it, stated explicitly. He was not a man who showed up to watch things that were not worth watching. Cassidy completed the pipeline in the winter of the year following her graduation. The outcome of a pipeline completion is not, in this world, a graduation ceremony or a formal announcement or a moment of public acknowledgement. It is a conversation and a set of subsequent conversations and a series of decisions made by people in rooms that Cassidy was not in, based on documentation she had not read, filtered through institutional processes that had their own timelines and their own logic. She waited. She had become very good at waiting. Not the passive waiting of someone without agency, but the active, alert waiting of someone who has done everything within their control and is now attending carefully to what emerges from the things outside their control. It was, in its own way, the same skill as reading mirage. You couldn't make the wind do what you wanted. You could position yourself to respond to what it actually did. The conversation that concluded the process happened on a Thursday morning in a building in Virginia that she had been to twice before. The person who conducted it was a woman, which Cassidy had not expected, though she examined that lack of expectation afterward and concluded it reflected an assumption she should have interrogated earlier. The woman was in her late 40s, with the specific quality of authority that comes not from rank or title, but from a long record of decisions that turned out to be right. And she spoke to Cassidy with the directness and economy of someone who had made many important decisions and had learned that clarity served everyone better than careful hedging. She told Cassidy what the outcome was. She told her what it meant in practical terms. She told her what would come next. Cassidy asked 2 questions. The first was about scope, the specific range of contexts and missions in which her capabilities would actually be employed. The answer was more expansive than she had allowed herself to anticipate, and she received it without visible reaction, filing it for later processing in the way she had learned to file important information during high-stakes conversations. The second question was about the people she would be working with, and whether they knew her background and how they had responded to it. The woman told her that the people she would be working with had been briefed on her record, and that the response had been, with 2 exceptions whose objections were noted and overruled, professional and without significant resistance. She said that the 2 exceptions had in both cases revised their positions after reviewing her full evaluation record, and that in one of those cases, the revision had been accompanied by a comment that the woman relayed without particular drama. The comment was from a senior operator who had initially been among the most skeptical voices in the process. After reviewing Cassidy's complete documentation, he had written in the evaluation record a single sentence. It said, "She is better than most of the people I have trusted my life to, and I have trusted my life to very good people." Cassidy flew back to Montana that weekend. She drove out to the property and walked to the range behind the house, which was unchanged, the same berm, the same steel target her father had placed at 300 yards when she was 9 years old, the same sight lines down the same mountain valley. She didn't bring a rifle. She just stood there for a while in the cold mountain air, looking at the distance between where she was standing and where the target was, and thinking about what it had taken to get from that target to everything that came after it. Not the training, not the pipeline, not the evaluations and the letters and the conversations in Virginia. The thinking she was doing was about something quieter than any of that. She was thinking about a 9-year-old who had picked up a rifle without any particular ambition attached to it, who had been curious about why the bullet went where it went, who had kept a notebook and filled it and started another one, who had been laughed at by people who did not yet have the information they needed to know better. She thought about what she would say to that 9-year-old if she could. She considered it seriously, the way she considered everything. After a while, she decided she wouldn't say anything. The 9-year-old hadn't needed advice. She had needed exactly what she got: the mountain, the target, the cold air, and enough solitude to find out, on her own terms, what she was made of. The advice would have been a distraction from the only thing that actually mattered, which was the work. It was always the work. Every shot a question, every question worth answering, every answer leading to the next distance, the next wind, the next impossible target that turned out, when you finally understood it clearly enough, to be exactly where you had always been aiming. She stood there until the light started to go. Then she walked back to the house, where her father was making dinner, and the mountains were turning dark against a sky, the specific color of a winter evening in Montana, which is a color for which there is no adequate word in any language she had ever encountered. She sat down at the kitchen table. Dale put a plate in front of her. Neither of them said anything for a long time, which was exactly right. There was nothing left to prove. There was only what came next.